Hey, Damon. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you.
Okay.
You're not on video, right?
Well, I thought I was. So let me turn it on. I've been on conference call since 9:30 this morning.
Okay.
Oh, it says you have disabled the video.
Yeah. Do you? Hey, Jalen, can you
Yes, sir.
can you take a look at Fernando's background and Jen? Make sure we're good.
Perfect. Yes, I can. It says that we're pushing out to the audience now.
Okay.
Is the video on now?
Yes, it is.
Okay, thanks, Scotty.
Cool. Damon, whenever you're ready.
Good afternoon, NAMAD family and friends. Welcome to another NAMAD Daily Convention webinar series. Today we have a very special guest, Ms. Soledad O'Brien. Before I introduce Soledad, I want to just read some brief you on her bio. Soledad O'Brien is an award-winning journalist, entrepreneur, and host of the weekly syndicated political show, Matter of Fact. Through the power of storytelling, Soledad O'Brien brings a fresh perspective on diverse and contemporary issues to foster change in your own community or organization. As the host of the Sunday morning syndicated political show, Matter of Fact, with Soledad O'Brien, Soledad has established herself as one of the most recognized names in broadcasting by telling the stories behind the most important issues, people, and events of the day. A champion of diversity, she gives voice to the underserved and disenfranchised through her Emmy-winning reporting and acclaimed documentary series, Black in America and Latino in America, while also contributing editor, reporting in-depth news magazine pieces for PBS NewsHour and corresponding for HBO Real Sports with Brian Gumbel. A prominent philanthropist, Soledad is the founder of Pow Her Full, a foundation that mentors and funds college tuition and expenses for young women. On stage, Soledad draws from her life and career to stimulate thoughtful conversation on the roles we each play with our communities and organizations, leaving audiences with memorable takeaways on the power of individuals and companies to make meaningful and lasting change. We were blessed to have Soledad with us about 4 years ago, and we're definitely blessed to have her with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Soledad O'Brien.
It's mute.
I wanted to say welcome, but of course, it's weird because I'm in my bedroom and you're all at home as well, or in the office. But thanks for having me back again at NAMAD. I thought that it would be a good time to have another awkward conversation, because I think often when we talk about race and equity and class and structural racism, all those things are difficult conversations. And we know because people here in America are in the streets right now protesting, and people are really trying to figure out how they are going to deal with the issues that are really, I think, at the heart of what's happening in America right now. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about my background and the work I've done, and then maybe I'd have an opportunity to take some questions at the end of my talk. I started working in TV news in 1987, and I loved it because I loved telling stories. I was pretty good at it, but more than that, my job was actually removing staples from all 3 floors of WBZ TV in Boston. My parents, who had spent like $100,000 on my education, when they found out that that would be my job, to say that they were disappointed does not come close to how my mother felt about my job. I had one of those things, and I would literally go around the building and do this. But I loved it. I love being part of a team, obviously, the lowest part of the team. And I loved knowing that I could grow that job eventually into pulling a newscast together, telling stories to an audience. I mean, I might be answering phones and removing staples, but obviously there was much, much more. And pretty quickly, I figured out where the power lay, and it wasn't with our morning anchor team, which I am horrified to say I can't remember their names. Oh my gosh. The power obviously is in the people who can be the, open the door, close the door. The power is in being able to leverage certain voices and certain perspectives. The power is in the hands of producers who would decide what topics we would cover and how long we'd cover them for, and whose voice would be elevated and whose voice would be ignored. They would decide, in fact, who got left out of the narrative altogether. And I quickly figured out that I might be able to one day have some influence on that front. But basically, when I started back in 1987, I was a woefully underpaid, low-level production assistant. And as I climbed the ladder, it never really occurred to me that I would have an opportunity to cover some of the biggest stories of our time: the Southeast Asian tsunami, the Haiti earthquake, every election. We would do documentaries like Black in America and Latino in America and Gay in America and Muslim in America and Education in America. I did not name these documentaries because I think I'd be a little more creative. But they were very powerful documentaries that won us a bunch of awards and also grew our audiences by a lot. When I started, I'll confess, I was just trying to figure out the gig. And by the time I became a newly minted reporter in San Francisco by 1993, I had a few more skills and just a little bit more talent. Terrible story. My very first assignment live, so I'd been at this station, KRON, for a week. My very first assignment live, after they promised me I would not have to go live, was to go cover the San Francisco Giants, who'd made it into the playoffs. Dusty Baker was the coach at the time. And I was sent to a bar with a bunch of other people who didn't have tickets to the game. And I interviewed people who were watching the game at the bar. And then I'd write my story, and they're drinking, and I'm editing, and they're drinking, and I'm setting up my live shot, and they're drinking, and you know exactly where this is going. And it's nowhere good. Just as I stand up for my live shot, Soledad O'Brien is standing by live at Joe's Pub. All of a sudden, I'm like, wow. Everybody's really drunk and they're really close to me. It was my first live shot ever. And just as I actually started talking, a guy behind me reached out and pinched me on the behind. Now, obviously, time stood still. If you've ever been like so freaked out that you go like, that's what I did. I also learned never, ever, ever, ever let people stand behind you in a live shot, ever. But it was my first. And I remember eventually I managed to get through the live shot. They took the piece that I'd worked on, came back to me, I mumbled something, finished up. And if you've ever had anything go really wrong, usually what happens is a friend says something like, it wasn't so bad. I mean, maybe it felt bad, but it didn't look so bad. Mine was the opposite. People would say, oh my God, what happened? And in fact, my boss, his name was his name was Al, called me into his office in San Francisco and started thinking about like smaller markets I could go to because my first live shot was such a complete disaster. And I called back to my previous boss who had left at NBC News, where I'd been a producer. So this was my first on-air job. And he said something interesting to me. He said, whatever you do, do not quit. Make them fire you if they have to, but do not quit. This is a learnable skill. Put your head down and learn the skill. And it was great advice. Within a couple of months, I was decent at doing live shots. And I would actually become the bureau chief for KRON TV's East Bay because I was the only reporter in the East Bay. So I named myself bureau chief, which I thought was brilliant. And I would go on to cover all the stories that you cover in local news. There was a mambo snake loose in San Francisco, and we covered that. I think that was a hoax, but we covered it. I'd stand at the fish market holding a big giant fish and say the fish market was open. I covered, crazy story, out of Berkeley, a guy who said that who believed that his roommate who had passed away had been reincarnated and come back to life as his cat. We actually did that story. And more horrifyingly, I did a live shot holding the cat on my shoulder, which is, I mean, if you're buying the premise, is completely disrespectful. My husband calls this entire phase of my career not my best work. I stood on the Bay Bridge and would tell people, it's windy out, don't stand on the Bay Bridge, because that's kind of what we did in a local news. And I remember one Christmas day, I was sent out to go cover a story because there had been a shooting on Christmas, and we never had any news on Christmas. And obviously I was the lowest reporter, so I would be working. A woman in Oakland had a son and a daughter, and the son had gotten a BB gun for Christmas and shot his sister. And I remember all of us camped out on the front yard of this woman. And at one point she came out and said, could you please leave? And I just remember thinking, like, leave? Lady, I've got a 10 a.m., crosstalk at 11 o'clock and a noon news, and we've got to show it, cut in at 1 and 2 and 3, and a show at 4 and a show at 5 and a full hour at 6. And we had already created the graphic, the animated graphic, meaning it moved and had music. And it was called something like A Christmas Tragedy. And it would hint at this woman maybe being a bad mother, or, just all the drama and the froth around the story, without us actually sitting down with this woman and trying to talk to her about the influences of her life, but what her story was, what her point of view was, right? I'm camped out on her lawn, but this story is actually not about her at all. It's about me and how I see her. And, I think this was very typical of what we did, but I only will take responsibility and say that what I did as I look back now, I'm ashamed. I'm ashamed at how we covered these stories, because we wouldn't almost like not let a good headline get in the way of a story. And sometimes I look at the news and I see similar things, right? There's tons of froth, but very little diving into complexities or nuance or history or context. All those, and contradictions, right? Like all those things that make us human, to understand and explain the human condition. I certainly wasn't doing that in my very first reporting job. And I failed people as a reporter. I failed to do a good job telling those stories. And I think when I started to figure out, like, how do we tell the stories of people and give context to their lives, was in Hurricane Katrina. We got to the city a week after the storm hit, after doing interviews with state and local and federal officials that were just disastrous for them. The last residents were leaving. And I remember running into a woman who was pushing a shopping cart with all of her belongings and her children in the cart, asking me, who'd just gotten to the city, how could she get out of town? And our next months would be spent accompanying the Coast Guard on rescues as they broke through roofs to get into attics where people had holed up or sometimes had cut their way out. You'll remember the mayor at the time, his final words basically to his people were, grab a freaking axe. That's a quote, because you might need it if you had to cut your way out. That advice, as pathetic and as late as it came, actually would save some lives. And I guess for me, witnessing that as a reporter, complete and utter failure for people who really needed it the most, and also recognizing that it wasn't the story of a storm, just like the story of the woman on her lawn. It was much more complicated than that we had to talk about more nuance in stories. And if you were covering this like a storm, you were missing the entire point. It was about who has access and who doesn't, who gets information, who can get out, who can't. Why do people live where they live? It was much more complicated than that. And I guess for me, it felt like there was a sense of urgency around how to tell stories that were more complicated and more important about human beings. And so I think I knew at some point I would start covering race, and maybe race and class issues, a little bit in how I grew up. My parents used to tell me the story of how they met. My parents both passed away last year, but my mom was Black and from Cuba. My dad was white and from Australia, and they met because they both attended daily mass. So the takeaway of this entire story is you should go to daily mass. My mom didn't have a car, so she would walk, but my dad had a car, and he would basically hit on my mom. There's no way to clean that up. He would hit on my mom as she walked to church. And every time he'd say, would you like a ride? My mother would, as she would tell this story to me and my 3 sisters, sometimes my 2 brothers, you don't take a ride from a man you don't know well, apparently, even if you're both going to the same church. So day after day, my dad would ask my mom, would you like a ride? And whenever I tell this story to younger students, you have to remind them, like, there were no power windows. You had to like lean in and wind down the window to talk to somebody. Eventually, one day my mom caved and she said yes. And my dad, seizing the opportunity, asked my mom on a date. But because it was Baltimore and it was 1958, interracial dating was frowned upon, is how my mom put it. And I was like, well, what does that mean exactly? And she'd say, well, you could get shot. My parents went to a restaurant after restaurant trying to get in, but no one would serve them. They'd say to my mom, you can't come in. They'd say to my dad, you can come in, but you certainly can't come in with her. And so after finally being turned away from restaurant after restaurant, my mom brought my dad back to her apartment. My mother was an amazing cook of Cuban food, and she whipped up a meal. And the whole entire point of this story was not about segregation or integration or discrimination. It was, girls, if you can cook, you could get a man. I like to say I can't make it because I can't cook, but I can make it happen in about 20 minutes. My parents decided at the end of 1958 that they would get married in December of 1958. And so they got in my dad's car and they drove to Washington, D.C. because interracial marriage was illegal in their state and in 17 others. They drove to D.C. and got hitched, and then they drove back and lived illegally as a married couple. And when their friends would say, whatever you do, don't have children because biracial children will not fit in the world, I'm number 5 of 6. My parents were terrible listeners every step of the way. And in fact, my little brother, Orestes, was born the same year the Supreme Court would decide to overturn the ban on interracial marriage. My parents' marriage was now legal in Baltimore. And my mom used to say, you know, if you wait for people to get with what you're doing, you might be waiting a long time. And I guess I've always thought of those words as a little bit of marching orders. Like if we sit around and wait for everybody to do the comfortable thing, first of all, it probably won't happen for a really long time, but it might not happen at all. That sometimes we actually have to push to make things happen. I used to ask my mom, what was it like to live in Baltimore in the early 1960s when my older 2 sisters were born? And my mom said, people used to spit on her and the family when they walked down the street. And I remember thinking like, oh my God, that's terrible. And I asked her, I was like, Mom, so what did you do? And she said this, which I always thought was very interesting. And it also helped frame how I thought about reporting, frankly. And she said, Lovey, she used to call me Lovey, Lovey, we knew America was better than that. And I think in the way she answered, it also indicated that she knew that you had to opt in to helping America be better, what was promised, the more perfect union, if you will, right? That people actually had to decide to jump in and help, that this was not something where we could just all stay out and say, well, it's not me. It had to be all of us. A change was going to come because people decided that things weren't working and people would make that change. My family moved to the North Shore of Long Island when I was born in the mid-60s. And it was very hard for my parents to get a house. No one would sell to them. The discrimination in Long Island still exists to this day. No one would sell, obviously, to a Black family. So my dad could buy a house if he went kind of by himself to pick out the house, but not my mom. And we wouldn't speak Spanish either because my mom wanted us to be very assimilated. She thought the strategy was we could just sneak into our all-white neighborhood. And there's a picture of my family, probably from the mid-1970s. So I must be like 10. My dad is white, bald. My mom is Black. She had a giant Angela Davis afro in which she kept her pick. 6, my 5 brothers and sisters, so 6 kids, all of us with afros. We're wearing, some of you will remember Danskin made that polyester, stripes this way on our tops, stripes the other way on our pants, but it was so thick you couldn't cut through it. And in this photo, we're leaned against our white VW bus. And I'm like, we probably could have gone with the Spanish. My mother's walking around with an afro with a pick in it in this all-white neighborhood. As much as that picture is crazy, it also, I feel very warmly about that picture. And whenever I tell the story in a crowd in real life, as opposed to remotely, people always laugh because I think it brings up for them stories of their own childhood, like where they come from as well. And I think that what I love about that photo and that story is that it felt to me like we had an American story too, that we had a family story that was valuable and that was worth sharing and worth telling. And sometimes journalism and maybe business in general, feels like there's only one narrative, there's only one story, there's only kind of one right way, and occasionally people get to fill in the margins, but everybody has a story. And so in journalism, I think a start to equity has been recognizing that all stories have value. And it's easy to say that and sound cheesy, but we've really been able to prove that. We've been able to show and prove that actually you can do very well and reach your audience more usefully and more fully when you recognize that there's a whole bunch of stories that you might not know about the people that you serve. We think certainly that all stories have value to this day, though, in spite of me being the one who does a lot of the documentaries around my documentary about homeless people will air on Friday. It doesn't really tackle the flip side of it, right? Which is the issues of hiring diverse journalists. Those numbers have not shifted over time. And who gets which jobs, the high profile jobs, the more jobs that pay better, who gets moved into management, who's making those editorial decisions that I just mentioned, the decisions that actually help elevate certain conversations. Who's the gatekeeper of who gets on TV and what conversations are happening, and literally exactly for how long. I think between the disruption of coronavirus and also the moment that we're seeing right now, I think there is an interest really in understanding racial justice and fairness and access and systemic racism and oppression. I mean, I really think like we're at a time when people do want to understand these things, not in a documentary like an intellectual conversation about it, but in a very, but writ large within an organization. Like, what does it feel like to, what does racial justice mean? What does it feel like in an organization? Like if you have an organization, what does it mean at NAMED to have racial justice? What would that actually look like? Not just, listen, it's Martin Luther King Day and we, but what does this actually mean to try to move the needle to make sure that you're being fair and equitable? And that's a very different conversation, I think, than we've had before. And I think the time is ripe for it, or at least maybe I'm hopeful there is. When we did Black in America, we focused on policing, and I'll show you a clip in just a moment. I'll ask them to roll the clip in just a second. The doc was called Black and Blue, and it looked at stop and frisk in New York City. And we focused on a young man named Luis who had been stopped by the police and very badly injured in his interaction, in fact. And we wanted to show kind of the sense of really the moment I think we're in now, right? The emotional turmoil that happens when you over-police a community, that it actually has repercussions that are very deep and very and felt very strongly. So let's play this short clip from my documentary, Black in America, that focuses on policing. Can you roll that clip, please?
Tell me a little bit about where we are in East New York.
It's referred to as Little Baghdad because of the murder rates and a lot of the violence that happens, and that includes with the police.
So when you were beaten up, now a couple of years ago, I know it's painful for you. Do you mind walking me through that day?
Every time I'm asked about the incident, I close my eyes and I can see myself there again.
In August 2012, he saw police stop a young Black man for riding his bike on the sidewalk. The routine stop suddenly turned violent.
More officers started arriving onto the scene. They beat his legs, they maced him, they tased him.
Why were you so interested in what's happened to this kid? You didn't know.
I mean, honestly, the kid could have been my brother. So I just wanted to make sure that he was all right.
The police asked Luis to move away. He says he did.
They yelled at me when I got right here, and they said, stop right there, where do you think you're going?
Yeah.
So I stopped,
right,
and I turn around. 5 officers line up around me. The tallest officer, he tells me, are you some type of tough guy? And he tries to grab my left arm. So I move my left arm back. I said, there's no reason for you to touch me. So I walk away. All the officers are continuing to follow me. So I get really nervous because I could hear like the buckles and the walkie-talkies and everything. When I turn around, the tall officer punches me in the face. I hit the floor and he screams, he's resisting arrest. And a swarm of officers from everywhere came to me.
He ain't do nothing. He ain't do nothing. He ain't do nothing.
You got the record.
Yo, he didn't do nothing.
Yo.
He ain't do nothing. He ain't do nothing.
I'm screaming, why are you punching me? Why are you kneeing me? Why are you kicking me? Just take me. And they just continue to assault me. They finally put cuffs on me. They finally get me up, but they're only picking me up by my wrist, which is what did the major damage to my shoulders.
Nothing. Why he ain't do nothing? My record that please.
Yeah, I got it.
Put that on everything. He ain't do nothing.
What would have happened if there was no video?
There wouldn't have been anything but my word against 15 police officers.
Luis's mom, Evelyn, used to trust the police, but has had a change of heart.
I brought up my kids to respect police. If they had a problem, they could go to a policeman and say, listen, I'm lost. Can you help me get home? The thing that bothers me the most is how can you come to someone that you can't trust?
Luis was charged with disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, and obstructing a government official. All charges were dropped. Police will not respond to the allegations because Luis has filed a lawsuit against the city.
That was one of the officers on the scene, too. Funny enough.
The police department's reforms were supposed to calm fears in minority communities, but intensive enforcement continues to exact a price. It's been 2 years. How come you can't get past it?
Every time I'm asked about the incident, I close my eyes and I can see myself there again.
Come on. Nothing.
I can see myself on the floor, getting punched, getting kneed, and asking why. Like, every day I wake up and I have the aches and pains in both my arms. I'll never be the same.
Tell me, if anywhere, where do you feel that?
Feels like my arms are gonna pop.
If you can tolerate it, let it stretch, because if we don't do anything, this is as far as you're gonna get.
Luis's recovery process has been slow. He goes to physical therapy every week to try to rehabilitate his injured shoulders.
Hold on.
It's a little scary there, huh?
Yeah, hold on.
After the altercation, he underwent 2 surgeries to repair torn ligaments. He's waiting on a third. He was once a college football player.
Tell me how you're feeling when you're doing that.
I'm frustrated only because
Yeah,
I was doing 100 reps in a set,
I bet.
and now I can barely do 3.
He's trying his best, trying to overcome this. There's still moments where you can see it and he's thinking far away. He's silent. You see those slight changes, you know there's more to it.
Am I ever gonna be 100% again?
We all change all the time. We don't go back. You're not going to be Luis of 2 years ago or 5 years ago. You're going to be the new Luis. And it's challenging, but that's the truth.
So one of the things that we were interested in our in looking at policing was really analyzing how police interact with the community. An interesting story off of that story that I'd like to share. So we were bringing Black in America to media critics before the show itself launched, the series. It lasted for 9 years. And I was at something called TCA, the Television Critics Association, and you kind of sit on a stage and people in the audience who are journalists ask you about your reporting. So people would say, tell me about this documentary. The original doc was 6 hours long, focused a lot on Dr. King, and then looked at modern day life for African Americans. And so people would say, well, how did you pick the people who'd be in the doc? Was there an organizing philosophy of the doc? What was one of the things that you took away? And so for that question, I remember saying, you know, the thing that I thought was most interesting in this doc was that as we looked around the issue of policing, that people we were profiling within the doc who were either wealthy or in some cases solidly middle class or in some cases deeply in poverty. I mean, a woman who's being evicted from her home as we were interviewing her. The thing that was interesting that cut across all socioeconomic lines was the interactions with the police, that in fact, everybody almost sounded like they were reading off a script. When my son, sometimes daughter, but almost always son, when my son turned 13, I sat him down and I told him, if you are stopped by the police, here's what you need to do. Make sure you have your hands on the wheel like this. Make sure you don't move fast, blah, blah, blah. Same exact script for rich Black people, middle-class Black people, poor Black people. And so I answered this reporter's question and said that was one of the most interesting takeaways for me, that I thought that this was this conversation about how policing was just out of control in certain communities for African Americans, regardless of socioeconomics. After the panel, my boss's boss's boss, so he was the head of CNN Worldwide, this is a doc series we did for CNN, said to me, that's not true. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, that's not true. White people have the same conversations about policing with their kids. Now, I had spent 18 months producing this doc, so it's kind of a bold thing for someone to tell you. And I said, I don't think so. I think you're wrong. In fact, I think what these folks were saying is that they were working to keep their children alive. And I think for white people, and I grew up in a completely 99.999% white neighborhood, so I can tell you the strategy was much more, don't be a jerk if you're stopped by the police. It's not about saving your life. And I remember he said to me, this is my boss's boss's boss, it's just not true. Don't tell that story again. And so I didn't for years, literally, probably for 10 years, I didn't tell that story again because I really felt like I needed to keep my job and to keep doing the stories that I wanted to do. I needed to make sure that that it was framed in a way that made everybody comfortable, especially the people who were paying the bills for the series. And it's interesting, right? Like if you met this guy, you'd say he was a great guy. He was a really, really good dude. He funded 9 years of Black in America. But it was always interesting to me that he kind of couldn't reconcile in his own head this thing that he truly believed to be true, that he believed to be a fact, that he believed in his heart that this couldn't be true about policing and African Americans. And so I think for me, one of the things that we've tried to do as we've moved forward, and I think for organizations like yours, it's really important that we track and make sure we're holding people accountable, not to just to tackle the things that they're comfortable with, but to make sure that they're tackling the things that they're also not comfortable with and really flagging those things. Why are you so uncomfortable with this conversation? When we started Matter of Fact, which is a show that I anchor for Hearst, we started tracking the number of people we put on TV. So Black people, white people, male, female, Native American. I wanted a spreadsheet because I thought that I had a good sense about the kind of people that I picked to be on TV, but often we're wrong, that our own gut is just wrong on if we are, picking people who are diverse. I think we often over-index. If you look at every single economist who's on TV, it's usually a white dude in his 60s. And there's a reason for that. We feel comfortable. Our bias tells us that that's the credible face of an economist. So that's why you see a lot of economists, I don't think, who are older white guys. And I don't think sometimes it's done for, bad purposes and evil intentions, as they say, but often it's not. It's just what people feel comfortable with. And so we started tracking it. Like you could just measure what you were saying matters. Like if you really honestly believe it matters, then just write it down and just track it. And people would say to me, it got to the point where people would say to me, oh, what? So like you walk into a room and you count the number of Black people? And I'm like, yes, I do. I literally do. If this is an organization that purports to be about building diversity or about helping young women or about helping older women or about Native Americans, then yes, let's count. We should not be ashamed to count. And if we're not living up to what we say we're going to do, we should change it. And so I think there's potential for change, because I think we want to make tangible change now. And to do that, you have to be intentional. And I get the feeling that we're at a moment, and maybe it's just a moment, where people do want to be intentional. I think you have to use the narratives. People have a lot of stories, but also the data, which I know, obviously you guys do a lot of collecting of, to really show people where the gaps are in fairness. It's not enough to say, we're for racial justice. Like, what does that even mean when it comes to a company? What does that mean when it comes to an industry? Racial justice. I want to know, what does it mean when it comes to a workplace? We have to be able to say, our organization does X and we're going to get to Y. It has to be a moment of accountability, of really asking people, what do you want to do? What are you going to accomplish? What's the timeline for accomplishing that? And how are you going to get there? And we have to hold ourselves accountable. I mean, again, I think for our show, we just started to hold ourselves accountable to, if we keep telling people that we're going to have a show that's very diverse, then let's measure it and make sure we're holding ourselves accountable. I am optimistic, I guess, because I think coronavirus has been a massive, obviously, disruptor, and the protests in the streets as well. But I think it's led organizations, a lot of organizations, to recognize that we are in a leadership vacuum in this moment. We're in a leadership vacuum, that American leadership is, to a large degree, certainly politically, almost non-existent. And so that's a crisis. And that means that leadership, corporate world, leadership in industry, leadership in organizations needs to step up and make change, and make the change that they've been talking about sort of hypothetically or objectively or loosely for the last 10 years or more. And I think that means accountability, being open to difficult conversations, and really doing the work of examining policies, measuring employees, tracking their growth, and having real measurable, tangible goals to bring about change. I mean, really, if something's not working, sitting down and strategizing about why is it not working? Why are you not getting the employees you need? Are you looking in the wrong places? I feel like we're at a moment where this is possible because people are asking the right questions. And if you're asking the right questions, I think then you can be in a position to get the right answers. In a way, I think it's fair to say it's a test. Do we have the courage, the guts? Do we have the endurance? Because I think it's going to take a lot of endurance to make the changes that we've been talking about, and the changes that we like to hold up when we talk about America, that for a lot of people isn't the America that they live in. Not just because, racial justice is good, kumbaya, but because racial justice is good for business. We found with my show, 97% of all syndicated shows fail in the first season. We're going into season 5. We've grown our ratings. We're one of the top shows on the weekends, et cetera, but also younger and a more diverse audience. And so we're doing well business-wise by sticking to those things that we like to brag about. We found tons of rating success in doing something that actually wasn't just good to talk about, but it was important, I think, to do. Diversity makes us better and makes us more competitive. And it's not just some favor that I bestow upon you. I've decided today I'm going to put this person on TV. It's actually serving your audience, growing that audience, and it's good business. And I think we're in a moment where we can leverage that. I really do. And I hope we don't lose this moment, because I have not seen corporations, I mean, many put out, hashtag Black Lives Matter or whatever. And I don't think those things matter. I really don't. I think what matters, right, is the next step, is the moving into accountability, is the moving into what change looks like, and into the navigating difficult conversations to get to the kind of equity you want to see. I'm going to take I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to ask Damon Lester to come back into this conversation, because I think we have just a little bit of time for questions. Damon?
Thank you, Soledad. That was awesome. Really appreciate it. And I want to introduce our chairman that I did not forget to do it. I forgot to do it early on before I get in trouble. So Mr. Fernella, please come on if you are still there and you're not going to get me in trouble. There you go.
I won't get you in trouble, Soledad. That's incredible. You have an incredible life, an incredible career. We're so appreciative that you're with us again. I know you were in a conference a couple of years ago. Hopefully, we look forward to having you in the future. Maybe do it in person is a little bit better for all of us.
I accept. Yes, I think in person is always more fun, but we're managing Zoom just fine. Thank you, and thank you for having me.
Yes, we are. I guess it's the 2020 way to do business. We'll switch to the old ways in 2021. I do want to thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to spend this time with our dealers and our partners and talk about your incredible life, your career. I love your shows. Your stories are incredible and they're inspiring, especially in these unique times on it. I think you bring a lot of things that are good conversational pieces that we all should probably sit down and talk more about it. I agree with everything you said.
Thank you.
And I look forward to more conversations about it. But thank you so much for doing it.
You bet. Thank you.
Damon, thank you, Damon.
Hey, thank you, Fernando. So Soledad, just a couple questions for you. So about 4 years ago, we had gone before the Hillary Trump election, and we had some discussions about what did you see, what would be the talking points to get this election over on Hillary, for Hillary to win over Trump. What do you see going forward within this election between Trump, Biden, what will be some of the hottest topics leading into November that will be a deciding point?
Yeah, I think what are always the hot topics, right, are looking at those places that could be swing states. It always gets boiled down to the swing states and how they're doing. Obviously, coronavirus and these protests, I think, are really changing the map. I mean, there was a study out the other day that talked about how unhappy Americans are. And I think Americans are proud to brag about their exceptionalism. And right now we're very exceptional in number of deaths from coronavirus. But I think for a lot of people, the world feels very chaotic right now. It doesn't feel calm and solid and secure. And I think it's very anxiety provoking. So I think all those things are going to play a role in the election. I think we've seen a lot of failures in terms of leadership, both in these, obviously in these protests and also and step back in sort of policies around policing generally, and also in coronavirus. I mean, we know a lot of the data around coronavirus is new, but also we know masks work. I mean, in New York, I live in New York, so there's not a lot of drama around wearing a face. You can't go to the grocery store without putting a little mask on. But in other places, you're seeing people sort of take a public health issue and turn it into a political issue. So I think all these things are going to play a role. But at the end of the day, right, it's about voting and voter suppression and getting access to the vote. It's about who turns out and who doesn't, who's inspired to turn out for the candidate and who is not. I don't think it's hugely important who you pick as your vice president. I mean, past polls have told us that that's not super important, but we're in a different time. It's a kind of all bets are off time. So in a lot of ways, I think the same old things matter, but we're in a time where people are feeling unhappy and concerned for the fate of the country, concerned about how angry and hostile everything feels. And it's one of the reasons I think why organizations and companies and industries are stepping up to say, I guess we have to lead on this, because we know who wants to. It's not a good market to feel like you're selling things, frankly. You want people to feel good about where they are. So, it's going to be interesting to watch, because it always is. It'll come down to the wire, because it always does. But it's really, I think, in the short term, looking at swing states and what they're thinking about doing.
So you mentioned about one of the challenges we've had historically from NAMAD's perspective. We've always presented data as the business case for diversity. And we have data after data after data, and we hear a lot of rhetoric from some of our partners that, we're going to do this, we're going to do a better job. But the reality is you always hear an excuse, or when we ask for commitments to reduce to writing, you always get a little pushback from that. Right. What do you suggest as far as holding themselves accountable? Because I think we are in a finite window of opportunity here. What are some of the ways that you think we can increase our message to get that commitment?
Yeah, I think connecting with people is a combination of data and storytelling that lies on top of the data. One of the things that you always do in documentary, right, is to tell a good story, but it has to be bolstered by interesting data points. It can't just be sort of someone's personal story. I think that's a less interesting news documentary. So I think we're at a time when actually people are trying to figure out the data itself is not going to move them, but the data combined with stories. I am telling you, the number of white people who have said to me, I had no idea that my colleagues, professional people, were stopped by the cops. I've had so many white male friends say, Soledad, I'm telling you, I always thought if someone was stopped by the cops, there was a reason, right? Like it didn't just happen for no reason, that there was a reason, that, you know, that people who were stopped by the cops, they weren't a Girl Scout. And they said, now that I'm watching some of these videos, which they'd never really seen before, which I think Black people have seen for years, they're like, I just can't believe it. I mean, the number of conversations I had like that. So I think people's eyes are really being open to how systemic racism is working, how things that are unfair have been kind of built into the system. And so there's a real interest, right, in talking about Black Wall Street, talking about some of these historic issues and stories that we just don't bother to cover. And some of that is social media and the videos that we see that really tell a pretty intense story, because I don't think people necessarily would believe it. Here in New York, you know, we had the Amy Cooper walking her dog and the handsome birder Chris Cooper, no relation, and they interact. But someone said to me, you wouldn't have had all these protests if it hadn't been for Amy Cooper, which I thought was an interesting point, right? Which was, you had a person literally show, let me show you where my power is. Let me show you how I can unleash upon you, a guy who's birding in Central Park, if I want to, with these phrases that everyone understands universally are the phrases that will unleash the police. And in a way, it was brilliant, right? She did sort of like the test case of this is how this works. And I think for a lot of people, for Black people, it was like, and for white people, could not believe it. Like, right. So I do think we're at a different time, because I think people really are learning things and are discovering things that others hadn't. We saw this in Black in America, where you would just show the injustice. You know, I grew up in Long Island, and one of the things about Long Island, if you ever cut out of school and went to Robert Moses State Park to the beach, all the overpasses are very low, because Robert Moses didn't want Black and brown people coming from the city. So he made sure the overpasses were too low for city buses to make it out. And when you tell people that story, like, it was intentional. It wasn't that he mismeasured or he never thought about it. Like, he intentionally wanted to keep certain people out. I know, I grew up in a neighborhood where Black people were not allowed to live. I think so many people don't really realize that about American history. And I think we being journalists and probably educators too, have to do a better job of informing people. So I think we're in a moment where people do want to know. They really do want to understand it. And I think it's incredibly upsetting for everyone.
So do you think with the reporting, to your point about journalists, do you think that you find it difficult for the current journalists to be able to navigate from what is fact versus being accused of reporting fake news? Do you think that there is some challenges there?
Yeah, I think it's two things. One, I think there's a bit of a lack of courage, right? I think journalists need access, especially the political journalists, right? They need access to the White House, and we have a president who's going to withhold access if he's mad at you, and we've seen that. So that's one problem. So people don't want to challenge the president because there'll be some implications. That's a real problem. So so very often the way he answers questions becomes very hard for journalists to jump in there. But I also think if you're a White House correspondent, you need to be in the room to do your job. So you got to be careful in how you tread. So that's one problem. And I do think a lot of journalists are kind of doing this, well, this side says this and this side says that. And I don't think things work like that. I think there is a truth that you can get to. And I think there are facts that you can dive into. Just quoting someone, social media has made this problematic for journalists, but quoting someone saying the moon is made of cheese does not make the moon made of cheese, right? I mean, I think the journalist's job is not to say, well, he says the moon is made of cheese, but she says it's not. It's to say, he says the moon is made of cheese, the moon is not made of cheese, and I'm going to tell you why this person is lying to you and telling you why the moon is made of cheese, because we have to give context. I think it's just been a very difficult challenge for, certainly for the White House correspondents really struggle. They struggle to use the word lies. They struggle to give context. And I'm hopeful that that'll change, that people will really learn to stand up and call out the things that are inaccuracies, that are lies, that are misstatements, that are just sometimes stumbles and fumbles. Sometimes you just get something wrong. But I think it's been a hard job to be a journalist.
So we have a question from one of the attendees. As a dealer, we see how little and slow real change has not happened in economic opportunity. In your industry, did the Byron Allen lawsuit hurt or help move us forward on opportunities?
That's such a great question. And I don't think it had an impact, to be honest. I mean, it's something that everybody was talking about, but I really don't think it did, because Byron Allen is a unicorn, right? It's such a one case. It's not like there's a large number, and our numbers in my industry for diversity and for people who own, who are people of color is very, very tiny. And so in a way, I think that it certainly was something people were talking about, but I don't know that it's seen as anything other than this one instance. And I don't think a ton is going to change around it.
So you talked about this earlier. So do you think that us as minorities are fairly represented in front of and behind the camera? You mentioned it earlier with being at CNN and the other news outlets. So do you think that there is, or what needs to happen for have us both on the front end and on the back end of your industry? Because we're experiencing the same thing in the auto side as well.
Yeah, we're not. I mean, on camera, sure. But I mean, if you're going to ask somebody where the power is, it's not the on-camera position. There are certain on-camera people who get paid a ton of money and can oversee shows. I was one of those people, and you can, kind of organize how you want to tell stories, and you have a fair amount of clout. But that's not the clout to run a network. That's not a clout to say today's entire narrative is going to be X, or here's the person that we can put on the air, or here's how we're going to think about an issue. The gatekeepers are the producers, the executives, right? The high level executives. And if you look at those ranks, they're not diverse at all. They're not diverse at all. And so at some point you have to ask yourself, well, is it just because people, when I started in 1987, everyone talked about the pipeline. Well, there's a pipeline issue. We're still talking about the pipeline issue when a pipeline could have been built and rebuilt, and it's very frustrating because it makes you realize it's not a pipeline issue. It's having an interest. It's having the political will, if you will, or just the will to fix it. I've done interviews with executives, and I've asked them, why don't you measure certain things? And they'll say, well, and they'll dance around. But if you ask them about their, a product, if this were a refrigerator, I feel like you would have solved it, because, you sell refrigerators, and you would never, ever just say, we don't know why this refrigerator is not working. Right. But we do it with people all the time. And sometimes I think for people, it doesn't have to just be diversity is good to do. I think we marketed diversity as a good thing to do for a long time. And I don't think that's a way to think about it. I did an interview with a guy who made ships, built ships. And he said, it takes about 8 years to become a master shipbuilder. But he would lose his employees, many of them, around year 3. His diverse employees, he'd lose them. And he said, finally, he'd never really thought about diversity, but the population where he was getting his employees from, the public school system, had shifted. Now it was far more diverse, more African-American students. And he just never thought about the environment. Why? Well, because the environment was his environment. And so only when it hit his bottom line of like, well, if I keep losing employees year 3, and I'm investing all this money, and I don't really get it back till year 8 when they become master shipbuilders, suddenly he's like, what's going on with our environment? It looks good to me, but what am I missing? Because all of these people stay for about 3 years and then they quit. And he tells the story very openly about how he had to learn to care about diversity, that he had never even thought about it. He's like, we pay people well, we're happy to have them, but it's more than that, right? It's opportunity, it's access, it's feeling like you're included in conversations. And he started really focusing on diversity within his company. And he talks now a lot about sort of how he saw the light, because it was just a business case. I was losing money, and that environment mattered. And just because I was comfortable in the environment didn't mean that everybody else was. And he was able to turn it around. And so I think you're going to see more people who recognize that there's a value years ago, we used to pitch diversity as like good to do, kumbaya, good to, it has to be a winning argument. In my business, a show that doesn't get ratings doesn't get renewed. So forget about it being good to do. No one cares about it. It literally gets canceled first. So when I do a project, it has to win. That's how it makes everybody want to stand by it. And we try to show people you can have diverse teams and cover diverse topics and win every time. We just do. And I think that's going to be the strategy. And now I think people are primed to see that.
So I have another question from the audience. How do you see corporate America moving forward with what's going on in the country with regards to diversity?
Listen, I think half of corporate America puts up a hashtag Black Lives Matter and some kind of graphic and they're done. Like, I'm good. But actually, I've been involved in a lot of conversations with many organizations within corporate America really want to figure it out. They really are like, we have got to figure this out. We've been talking about changing our numbers. We've been talking about goals, but we never set real measurable strategies around them. Years ago, I interviewed Lee Scott at Walmart, and I really like talking to him because he's a very blunt dude. You know, he doesn't mess around. And what I really liked in discussing with him was about how do you get to the results you want? And he said, you know, you actually have to hold people accountable, that it wasn't enough to say, interview a diverse slate. It wasn't enough to say, you know, try your hardest. And he said, you know, once we actually held people, you don't get your bonus if your teams are not diverse. And however they were defining diversity at that time. And he said, you know, we just had to do it once. You just had to have one guy who didn't get his bonus, right? Like one person who realized, oh my God, the CEO is serious. And Lee Scott was very much the leader of this, right? So he was the CEO who's like, oh no, this is not a initiative. This is a priority for me. I think it's just a leadership issue. And I actually feel good. Half of America, hashtag, put it out on social media, you know, but actually the other half, I think they're genuinely trying to figure it out because there is a lack of leadership and they need to solve this problem. And you guys, you have to help them solve this problem.
In our industry, we deal a lot with some companies who have adopted the Rooney Rule. And in many instances for us, we've seen the Rooney Rule is just to check the box. And there's an excuse of, well, he won't get it because he didn't have the piece of property, or he won't get it because he was short money. And our argument is, if you have a commitment to diversity, why give it to the guy that looks like you that has 40 stores versus giving an opportunity to someone that you don't feel comfortable with because you don't know them, your folks don't know them, and there's this thing that I have to work hard to build a relationship with. And so we go against the Rooney Rule in many instances because the Rooney Rule for us don't work. And
listen, it's a leader. You're talking about leadership, right? You're literally saying we have to make some uncomfortable changes. If you really believe what you're selling, if you genuinely believe that this is important to your organization, to your industry, to your country, if you believe that, then you have to work toward it. And that means a level of discomfort around solving the problems and figuring out why we haven't gotten there yet. Some people will want to do it. Some people will actually start measuring and saying, how come, you know, if we want to find Black students, why are we not at HBCUs? Like, I mean, you want to find some of the best, smartest Black students? Well, guess where they are? You know, some are at Harvard, some are at Yale. A whole bunch of them are at HBCUs.
That's right.
That's never really been a conversation for people. And now I think some organizations will genuinely try to solve that problem. And then others won't, right? They're going to talk a good game and they're going to talk about their wish list and, you know, say racial justice, but they won't really want to make change. I think we're at a better moment than we have been since I've started doing these documentaries a dozen years ago.
Well, Soledad, our time is up. And I want to thank you once again for joining us. You're part of the NAMAD family. Thank you for joining us and celebrating our 40th anniversary with us this year. And we have a friend in you. Please follow Soledad on social media because she is off the hook. And
yeah. Thank you, and happy anniversary. Happy anniversary. Happy number 40.
Yeah, and I appreciate you personally, and NAMAD thanks you as well.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right, you take care.
You too.